a gentle breeze blowing across an otherwise still lake. Like that's as close as I could get to accurately describing my experience. This like gentle, I mean, this is why Luciano calls it the force. It's just like, it feels like it's sort of animating everything or allowing even animation itself to be possible. It feels like it allows possibility to be possible. Like not things, but possibility itself is possible because of this thing that you're experiencing in and behind everything. And man, I felt like I had arrived. It felt like the most pure layer three experience of like just that full, like rich, delicate fullness and love. But like love is the wrong word. Love feels vulgar to say. Like that's how pure this is. That the word love.
Welcome to the Max Hack podcast, where we awaken together and share our greatest gifts with the world. My guest today is Rastal, researcher, entrepreneur, and author. He's one of the late location finders in the finders community, and Rastal will share his own model of consciousness and the progressive stages that he went through. So I'm glad to have you on the podcast, Rastal. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Max. Excited.
So, how was your life before awakening? In a nutshell, like, did you grow up with any spiritual or religious past that you follow?
Yeah, so I'm originally, well, and I still live, I'm back living in South Louisiana. And here, pretty much everyone's Catholic. So just like that, my first 4 years of my life, me and my family were Catholic. Then some things happened, and we ended up out of Catholicism, more in a like Pentecostal charismatic branch of Christianity, specifically the Assemblies of God, if anyone's familiar with Christian denominations in the U.S. And so a lot of speaking in tongues, Holy Spirit type stuff, very high energy types of worship services. And um, I got really focused on like connecting with God as deeply as possible and things like that very early on. Like when I was 5 years old, I remember like committing myself to Christ and like reading the Bible and things like that, like really kind of intensely getting into it. Um, I mean, there's a when I was 8 years old, I remember like reading the story of the old woman who was trying to give the last of her two alms or whatever to the temple, and Jesus was saying how she, like, even though she only gave 2 pennies basically, she was actually giving more than all these rich people who were only given a fraction of their thing. And I remember reading that, and I had like $10 to my name right in my piggy bank. And I was like crying to my parents, like, what? Like, I should be able to, like, I need to give this. Like, I have to give this. God is telling me to give this. And they were like, no, you can, it's fine to like save your money. It's also fine to do that. But like just those sorts of things, I was like really trying to like really listen to God. And even at that early age, at the same time, I was going through, I mean, I have a long history of trauma, like a lot of childhood stuff. The family I grew up in was really, oh, here's my cat. The family I grew up in was really intense. A lot of abuse going on, and um, I think a lot of my spiritual stuff was trying to, like, in a way, was trying to soothe that. And on top of just having a natural inclination towards it, there was an element of trying to soothe the pain of my existence. So
Hmm.
I was depressed and suicidal, like on and off for pretty much my whole life, and it was not fun. I mean, and then part of my depression, there was a lot of like pressure on me to become like this great spiritual teacher at like from 4 years old. Like I was being told that I was going to be the Moses for my generation. So like literally biblical levels of pressure were being put on me.
Who told you this?
Well, apparently I had a dream when I was that young about something like that. And then my parents like kind of told me again and kind of reinforced that my whole life, which was really intense. So like the reason I'm bringing this up is because it ties into my depression when I was married. My ex-wife, wife at the time, obviously, but and bless her heart for like trying to deal with all my insanity. Um, but she knew that if I got drunk, there was like a 50-50 chance of I would either be like loving and like so just like doting, or I would be depressed because I knew that I would never feel like my life was a success, because the only way I could see it as a success if it, thousands of years from now people are still impacted by the things I did. Like that's the only, like, it was impossible for me to ever feel like I actually did what I needed to do on this earth because of that kind of pressure. All right, so yeah, suicidal, depressed, blah blah blah. I went through a ministerial internship. I was planning to be a pastor or a missionary or something with these.
On your way to Moses?
On my way to Moses, God. Yeah, man, yeah. we can get into that at some point. But halfway through my internship, which I'm doing like all sorts of seminary type stuff, like a lot of theological studies and like preaching and mentoring people, I realized I didn't consider myself a Christian anymore, which was really tough because my entire support network, my entire life was geared around Christianity. I knew I had all these real experiences though, so I knew it was. I had seen so many people leave Christianity and then like throw out all these like genuine experiences they had, which didn't make sense to me because like I knew that these were real. Like the sense that I wanted to give away like my money as a kid, like I knew that there was a real thing there, even if like I didn't know how to express it. Or like when I was 5 and like gave myself to Christ, like there was something there that I was tapping into that I knew I didn't want to throw away. So um, after Christianity, like I dug into chaos magic and things like that. That was probably the main thing for a while. Like I wasn't connected to any other practitioners, but just the idea that belief is a tool really resonated with me. That um, if you allow yourself to adopt a framework, like a mental model, whatever, that actually changes your reality, and you can use that in a way to like get things. And I know, so like Karen Thorson, for example, has talked about this in POK talks, like, okay, if you believe that you have 7 chakras, you're going to start manifesting energy as 7 chakras. But if you believe a different model, your energy is actually going to change and manifest in a different way. And it's so like you can use that to, it doesn't work for everything, right? Like you can't believe that there's no gravity and then try to jump off a building. The odds are that's not going to work for you the way you want it to. But like in general, your belief affects a lot of your reality and like your perception and like your worldview. So I was playing around with that, and had a
How
lot
old
of
were you there?
like 21 or so whenever I left Christianity. Yeah, let's see, that was like the border of 2009 and 2010, like right at the new year, basically. That was happening. Oh yeah, so I guess that's like 22, 23. Anyway, I don't know, but I was like just after college. Um, And around that time is when I was given the name Rastal in a dream, and it felt like it came out of it. It felt like my real name, and like more than my given name that was given at birth. And I didn't tell anyone this. I told like 1 or 2 people, but mostly I didn't tell anyone this. And then 7 years later, it still felt like that. Like it was more my name than my birth name. So I started introducing myself as that, and um, eventually legally changed it. Like this was 2018. I legally changed it. I'm trying to think of what else. I mean, there's so much to give. Oh, so we can talk about awakening specifically. So that was 2009, 2010 that I stopped considering myself a Christian. Around 2011 or 12, I first heard Jeffrey Martin's first interview on the Buddhist Geeks podcast. And he was talking about this thing, PNSE, persistent non-symbolic experience. What's now called fundamental well-being, and it just something about it was like really fascinating to me. And even I think back then they weren't calling it locations, which he does now. It was like buckets of phenomena is how he was conceptualizing it. And just the first publications that he put out about like his initial research, just reading the descriptions of locations gave me my first glimpses of fundamental being or awakening. Like I had like these pure consciousness, like I could see through everything is what it felt like, right? It was like so beautiful. And every time it went away, there was like a sadness because it didn't last. It lasted for a few hours at a time, a couple of days at a time. A few years ago, it lasted the longest was like 2 weeks. I had it, and then I knew it just didn't feel like it was persistent. It didn't feel stable, so it drifted away. But every time it drifted away, something in me was like, "This is waiting for you whenever you're ready." Like this felt like the real underlying strata of things, right? Like that. Everything else that distracted me from that was just that. It was just a distraction. It's like, okay, I know this is there. Like, it's not like I'm suddenly like pulling something in that's not already here. So, okay, I was like, I'll trust. Even though I hated letting go of it, like something in me could trust. Like when I was in the tail end of it and it was kind of fading away, there's a part of me that really knew I could trust that it was there. And so every couple of years, I would go back and kind of see what updates had happened in the research. And every single time, just reading his freaking research gave me glimpses, and it was like so awesome. I loved it so much, and part of me really wanted to focus on that, but another part of me knew that that wasn't the right thing to focus on at the time. Um, Then a few years ago,
So just reading the research was sort of like a pointing to you, right? Like a like spiritual teachers when they do pointings, like Mochi, like talking about non-duality, for example, and trying to point you to it, so you follow their words to arrive at that place. And you got that
yeah.
from reading the research.
Right. Yes. Yeah. And I'm not the only. I've heard at least a couple other people have similar experiences. I think Luciano actually may have had experiences like that. Probably not quite as intensely as I did. And also, I mean, I knew about the research way before most people knew about it. Like most people, when they hear about the research, then they immediately do the 45 days course because it's like, wow, this is like I need to get this in my life. But for me, like something in me just it didn't feel like the right timing. So still off and on suicidal for a good while. Then I finally got like after COVID, like I mean things were rough for a bit. Like we can talk about how I lived on the streets for like 9 months, and
Why did you live on the streets?
I mean that this is a longer story. We can I can't fit it into this bit right here,
Okay.
but we can get into it. It was a spiritual experience for me though. But yeah,
Hmm.
like we can talk about it later in the interview maybe if we have time for it. But it's a long thing to get into. Um, but I ended up getting financially stable finally like a few years ago, and through that I was able to finally get help for dealing with my trauma. Like I got into EMDR therapy. I was getting treated for ADHD and things like that. Like got diagnosed with sleep apnea, which helped as well. Like because getting good sleep makes everything a lot easier usually. And um, so like I was getting stable like health wise and mental health wise. I did like 8 months of EMDR, and I finally was at a place where I wasn't like it had been a while since I've been suicidal. Like every now and then I was getting depressed, but it had been a while since I've been suicidal. And then there was an intense period of work where I was getting burnt out, like to the point where I could see that suicidal tendencies were coming. Like I had been through that process enough times that like I could see that I was feeling like, oh, it'd be a relief if I was dead. Like if a bus would hit me, oh my goodness, right? It was like it wasn't actively suicidal. I wasn't planning anything. It was just like, oh wow, it'd be nice if I wasn't alive anymore, which is pretty bad. So I was like, oh shit, like I really need to get this taken care of. So I actually like thankfully I was seeing a psychiatrist and everything. Like I had resources. So I reached out to them, went on 6 months, not 6 months, 6 weeks of disability leave, a short-term disability from work, to try to like really focus on getting me back to a good relationship with my work, so I wasn't burning myself out and things like that, and like focus on my own mental health again. And after 6 weeks, I was feeling pretty good, feeling stable again. And something about like after I got stable after that, something reminded me of Jeffrey Martin's research again. And I was like, I wonder, like, let me look into that again just to see what's there. And maybe it's the time. Something in me was like, maybe this is the time right now. I was living by myself. I basically didn't have any social life, things like that. And so I knew I had time to like invest whatever it needed to be, right? Like I was kind of a hermit already, like besides my day job. And so I was like, let's just see. And it turns out, one, I found out that they recommend people not try to transition into fundamental well-being if they're suicidally depressed because it can be a really intense experience, and then you have like almost whiplash effect. And so I was like, oh well, that's good. Like somehow maybe that's what I was intuiting. Like I don't know. I don't really have a good way of interpreting why I didn't pursue fundamental well-being for so long. But I'm glad. Like I'm glad that like my behavior ended up lining up with their recommendations. So that was cool. So I focused on some positive psychology practices, like they said. I consumed all the free resources they had because I wasn't sure if I wanted to do the 45 days thing. Um, Jeffrey has a video on finding your meditation fit, and he was pitching this at MIT or Stanford. I can't remember what school it was. He was giving this lecture on meditation, and he was pitching it in a way of like, oh, it's helping you focus or calm down or like things like that. But I could tell when going through these methods, I was like, this sounds like the stuff that's probably in his 45 days course. Like it just sounded like the same things to me. So I was like, maybe I can use this. And like I read their free ebook saying how to like stably transition into fundamental well-being and safely, but they didn't list any of the methods there. So I kind of paired up his finding your meditation fit video with their free ebook on the like protocol. I was like, all right, I'm going to commit an hour a day to at least, let's say 6 months is going to be my commitment. because I felt like whatever amount of time it takes at this point, it's gonna be worth it. Like I just knew, because I could see like how EMDR unlocked so much in my life, right? Like dealing with my trauma really changed my life in ways that I didn't even have to think about. Like it just automatically did it. And I felt like the same was going to be true of fundamental being or awakening, where it's like, just do it. And then it's just going to clear up so much that you won't even have to think about anymore. And it's like the benefits are going to be compounding over years. So that's kind of how I went into it. And I was like, yeah, so 6 months, an hour a day, that's what I'm going to commit to. If my first method doesn't work, after a week, I'm going to try a new one and kind of do the protocol that they talk about. And within 3 days, I was stably in fundamental well-being. So instead of 6 months, which was really great. And yeah, it's all history from there, which I'm sure we're going to get into. But that's kind of how I initially stably got there. I didn't do 45 days, didn't do Finder's course, even though I was notified when the first Finder's course was offered and almost did it. But yeah, I just kind of cobbled it together myself.
Before we dive deeper into fundamental well-being, or what we might also call awakening, I think we should give a little disclaimer about the language. I like to do this in these awakening interviews and podcasts. Maybe you just want to go ahead and, give your own disclaimer about the language.
Yeah, one thing that people get caught up in is getting caught up in the labels for these experiences, but we're trying to use words that don't mean the things that we're trying to point at. So it's a little tricky. Any word we use is going to be wrong. Like there's no way to actually describe what we're describing. So just be aware that I'm trying to describe things as like not metaphors. This is actually me trying to be as accurate for my experiences as possible. But language is tough. Like it's like so below language what we're trying to talk about here. Me and you were talking about this before the recording started, but I love what Bruce Lee's character says in Enter the Dragon when he's trying to teach one of his students. He's like, don't focus on the words that I'm saying. I'm like, try to get the thing that I'm communicating. And he says, it's like a finger pointing to the moon. If you focus on the finger, you'll miss the heavenly body in all its glory. And that's basically what the issue is with language and awakening. Don't focus on the words. Yeah.
Yeah, yesterday I spoke with a friend about ayahuasca, and I had an ayahuasca journey and he had one. So we had basically the same issue when we were speaking. We were like, yeah, it's super hard to explain certain feelings that people often have with ayahuasca, but it's super hard to explain it to someone that never experienced that.
Right.
Because it's so beyond the words.
Right, and I think that's a good point that you just said, like someone who's never experienced it, because one of the things, I mean, the function of words is to like relate things, hopefully, and like if I say a word, you can connect that to your own experiences, right? But if it's like literally beyond anything you've experienced, then the word is gonna conjure up the exact wrong thing every single time. Like there's no way you can get into that. So it's a tough one.
Mm-hmm. So I think it makes sense now that you walk us forward through your awakening fundamental well-being journey. And whenever it makes sense, please mention your model and the positions or stages of your model. So I'll put it on the screen while you talk about the certain area of the model.
Yeah. Yeah. So I usually tell people that my fundamental being is a product of Jeffrey Martin and his team, because like it's his research that gave me the initial glimpses. And I mean, I used his protocol without like going through his course. Like it was 100% the protocol that they came up with was what I used, and it worked. So I tend to use a lot of his language, like the locations and things like that. The Martin Matrix was really how I framed my initial awakening experience. So in terms of that, early on, I had the normal experience of like, you experience awakening or fundamental being and everything's beautiful, blah, blah, blah. And then at a certain point, pretty early on, normal life starts creeping back in. And most people think, and I knew this wasn't the case for me because I had listened to so many of his talks, but most people they would start worrying, oh, am I not really awakened anymore? But as long as you can access that peace or stillness or however the sense of awakening, however you want to frame it, it means you're still there. Like, because if you're not there, then it's really not easy to access that sort of thing. Like maybe you get it during peak experiences, right? So I could at least trust, like, even though it sucked that it wasn't ever present, like this amazing, like beautiful piece wasn't ever present. I knew at least that it was real, that I was stably there. And so I started, like when I was reading his descriptions of different locations, location 3, man, it just sounded like the most amazing thing in the world. Like you just feel love all the time. There's like basically no negative emotions. Um, yeah. You wanted to say something?
You transitioned to location 1 at first?
Yeah, it was location 1 at first. Yeah. Um, yeah, I guess I didn't mention that. But yeah, so like my goal was like, okay, I'm gonna spend decades trying to get to location 3, and I'm just gonna stay there for the rest of my life. And that was like I was so focused on that. So I used some of his videos. I mean, I consumed every video I could get my hands on. I everything that he ever talked about with the locations, layers, Martin Matrix, any Q&As he ever did. Like I really consumed all of it. I did the Thriving course that they offer, which I thought was really great. It felt like it helped me like ground and deepen my experience of fundamental well-being and really stabilize it. Um, and I was doing what they call sinking in, like as much as I could all the time. So for in case people aren't familiar with that terminology, sinking in is literally just focusing on that sense of peace or stillness or awakening, whatever you want to call it, that you associate with awakening, and just gently noticing it and allowing that to sort of expand, just like letting yourself notice it with open appreciation. And so I just would do that for hours. I was like, I'm gonna be the best person in the world at sinking in. Like no one's gonna be better than me. Is kind of how it felt. And yeah, it was. I was just doing that as much as I could. And then one of the things he said in one of his talks about the Martin Matrix was how you can use sinking in to sink lower through like the qualities and the layers, is how he framed it, of like you sink lower and lower and all of a sudden new qualities are showing up, and then they come to the foreground and then become where you're experienced. um, and so like he has 4 layers, and I noticed that they kind of correlated to the 4 first locations. Like location 1 is still very in the mind, layer 1 is the mind layer. Location 2 is that sense of spaciousness, or layer 2 is more of a sense of spaciousness, like you have space around your mind, your thoughts and emotions. And then location 2 had a lot, like that was like the primary experience of location 2. Same with layer 3 and location 3, where it's like this love and fullness, richness. And layer 4, location 4, was this like, it was just this, just unfolding, like kind of impossible to wrap words around. You can't really know it. And so I was like, the way he kind of talked about it, I thought, okay, if I can just get access to another layer, maybe I can use that and just stabilize. Like that'll be my new center of gravity, is kind of how I framed it. And so I tried doing that for 2, and like 2, like I got glimpses of 2, and I had like longer experiences with location 2, where I could tell that I was like not in my mind as much anymore, like stably. It was just I had this space around my thoughts. But it didn't ever last more than a few hours or a day. So then I tried, I think I connected directly to like the layer. I could really connect with this like fullness and life and love sort of thing. So I allowed myself to sink in like lower through the mind layer and like all that stuff, to use his terminology, which I don't really use anymore, but that was what I was using at the time. And I really sank into this feeling of fullness and richness and love.
Which is layer 3.
Yeah, layer 3, and then it ended up being location 3. But at the time, I didn't realize I was actually stabilized in location 3. I felt like I was feeling more loving to people and things like that, but it really didn't feel. It didn't feel as overwhelming as I thought it was gonna feel. Like it was like a normal thing, whatever. So I was trying to push further and further, and at one point I felt myself. It was like I felt this like friction, like a little bit above my forehead, and I was like, what if I am in location 3 already? And whatever that is agency, because that's like part of location 4, is that you lose your sense of agency. Like it's like the decision to make themselves, not you making the decision. And I was like, I don't know, blah, blah, blah. I couldn't figure out how to let go of that friction. It felt like I was holding on to agency. And so I just kind of let it go, and I was like, whatever. I'm just gonna keep trying to get to location 3. And then I did a EMDR session, which EMDR post awakening, EMDR pre awakening is amazing and life changing. Recommend it to everyone who's experienced trauma.
How this works, this EMDR session?
Oh yeah, I can go into that. Yeah, because I was doing that before awakening, and then I also did it after awakening, so I can like compare. It was wild, the difference. But basically, EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization. Wait, EMDR. Yeah, I actually don't know. Remember the what it stands for. It has to do with eye movement though. And for me, I did it over Zoom. It's usually in person, but it works just as effectively over like video chat. And so my therapist just would move his hands like this, and we dive. There's more to this protocol, but the core of it is just like I'm following his fingers. Then he asks what's coming up now, and so I talk about it, and then you're like, all right, just go with whatever you're feeling, whatever you're sensing in your body, and then just do it again. And new things would come up. So this movement allows blocks to kind of get unblocked because it's forcing you to move like bilateral movement. So there's a whole protocol with it of like diving into intense memories and things like that, and then trying to integrate it and like get your system to move around it to where it's not a block anymore. And it's incredibly effective. So yeah, I did that for 8 months, which is one of the main things that got me stable and not. It dealt with a lot of my trauma, and they didn't come back ever again. And then so after awakening, I got back into EMDR, and yeah, he which was like it was already I could tell it was like incredibly more effective. Like there was less in the way of just me doing the work in my body and like clearing things out. It was awesome. But so my therapist also offered like somatic yoga type of experience, like for an in-person thing. And so I was like, let's just do it. It just felt like the thing I wanted to do. I really needed to get in my body and work on some things and like just get myself moving in a way that was going to help deal with trauma. And so I went in for the session, and it was like a normal yoga session. I've done yoga before. It was fine. But at the end of it, we did this yoga inversion, and it was like a chair, but it has a hole in the seat. And so you like put your shoulders on the seat to where you're like upside down and your feet pointing in the air. And as soon as my feet pointed in the air and my like spine came into alignment, something shifted. I was like, oh, something just happened. I couldn't tell what it was, but I knew it was profound. Like I could barely even speak after that happened because he was like, how are you feeling? I was like, I felt like myself mumbling. I don't even know if I said words. Like it was crazy. And then after when I left and I was walking through downtown Seattle, because I was living in Seattle at the time, I realized, oh, it feels like the steps are just like my feet are just stepping themselves. Like it didn't feel like I was walking anymore. And like all the decisions that I made felt like they were just making themselves. It didn't feel like me making decisions. I was like, oh, I was already in location 3, like 100%. Like this is such a clear location 4 type of experience. And then I also had the thing of like, I think I feel happy right now, but also I can't remember what feeling happy felt like. So like, what did emotions feel like? Because I could tell things were still happening that I used to call emotions, but I couldn't remember what they actually felt like. So I was like, oh, that's probably what people like. That might be my way of experiencing what people means when they don't have emotions anymore, or something like that. Which I've later, after talking to lots of people, not everyone loses access to emotions in location 4. It's not a universal thing. Um, Especially if you've focused on emotions, like as a therapist or just like doing like therapy work on yourself, you usually can have better access to emotions. Has been the pattern I've seen. So anyway, location 4 was not at all what I expected. Like I was the person who was like, get to location 3, stay there for the rest of your life. You don't need to go past because like everything else is just, why would you want to detach from humanity that much? Is how I perceived it. And then I experienced location 4 and like the sense of freedom and how obvious it was. It wasn't crazy. It's not this like revolutionary experience. It's just so simple and obvious. And it feels more natural than anything else in the world when I first experienced it. And I was like, oh man, like I knew it. I knew it as soon as I experienced it. Like I have to see what's next. Like I have to, like there was nothing I could do anymore. I knew I was going to push further. I was like, well, maybe I'll spend the next several decades trying to get to 5 and 6 and like it'll take decades, right? So, you know, based on the things that like Anna Meek and Jeffrey talked about, I felt like it was probably a smart idea to prioritize being able to move backwards between location 4 and 3 and 2, that sort of thing, and getting good access so I didn't get stuck. I was really worried about getting stuck and not being functional in my life because I was a software engineer, and it was nice being financially stable finally for one of the first times in my life. Definitely as an adult, this is one of the first times in my life. And so I prioritized like making sure I could like bounce out of the location 4 type of no agency experience and be more grounded and able to interact with people. Um, I see less of a priority on that now, but also I'm further past it, so I don't have a. Anyway, So I was doing that. I was getting a lot of easy access to be able to bounce back and forth through these different experiences. And I was in 4 one day and I was sinking in, like doing that, like lowering through 4. And I felt like there was the same type of resistance that I had felt between 3 and 4, like that thing at the top of my head, which by the way, as soon as I went into 4, it cleared up. So I was like, oh, that seems like a thing. I noticed the same type of resistance behind my eyes from 4. And I was like, oh, this is interesting. Yeah.
So how did you feel that physically? Or how was that?
Like, I don't know, when your eyes get tense, like you're straining your eyes, it sort of felt something like that. But except I could tell it was specifically, it was almost at like the eye stems. I can't remember what they're called, but like the thing that connects your eyes to your brain, like that like connector, like that spot right there felt tense. Like it felt like there was like a resistance when I would try to lower through 4. At a certain point, I was brushing
Physical
up again.
tension.
Yep. All of my things were super physical. I had a very like body based experience of everything. I mean, even my emotions, I tend to talk in terms of like, oh yeah, my gut does this. Like it's just a body. Like a lot of my experience of emotions, I can interpret it more as emotions, but my primary experience is like very, very body based. So yeah, I was sinking in through 4, just like kind of letting myself experience the moment and like the unfolding experience, which is like the primary thing of 4. And I had this tension, like this resistance behind my eyes. I was like, I wonder if that's the next location. And also I knew that location 5 was associated with like light things or like a visual type of shift. I was like, I wonder if that has to, if, like, that seems like an interesting correlation that like I'm sensing this thing behind my eyes. So I ended up shifting into it. I had a little bit of resistance and I got frustrated and wasn't able to get there. So then I decided to focus on like being grateful for my location. Like the fact that I'm even in location 4 was way beyond anything I ever expected, right? The fact that I'm in fundamental well-being was way beyond anything I ever expected. It's like the best thing in the world. So I allowed myself to really focus on the gratitude of that and it overwhelmed my system. Then 15 minutes later, I immediately like slingshot into location 5. However, because the word glowing was so associated with like the people's location 5 experiences of like, oh, things need to be this radiant thing is how I interpreted it. I looked around, I was like, nothing's glowing. I tried to go in the dark. There's no like night vision happening, which is something, another thing that people say. I was like, yeah, I'm probably, whatever this is, I know it's a new thing. It's just not location 5. So I was like, okay, I'll just go back to 2 or 3 and go to my day job and do whatever. It was a little disappointing, but it was whatever. Then later that afternoon, I was sitting in a park because I like Seattle has amazing parks. There's like so many amazing sites and stuff in Seattle. So I was in a park that's sort of up on a hill, and I could see like the ocean and everything, and all the mountains in the background. Is one of my favorite places to go watch the sunset. And it was really like pretty close walk from my place that I was living. So I went there, and I was kind of like just like doing the location 4 thing of letting the natural world unfold before me because there was nothing like being in location 4 in nature for me. It was just like, yes, everything's beautiful and unfolding in this present moment. So I was like, let's just see what that shift was. Like maybe I can figure out what it was like from this morning. So I shifted into it. I was like, man, yeah, I really don't see anything. Like there's nothing going on. And then I noticed that I was staring at trees a lot more. And I was like, why am I staring? And I realized it was because the colors on the trees looked different to me. Instead of it looking like light was reflecting off the trees, it looked like the light was coming directly into my eyes. So like the color, not the light, sorry, the colors were coming directly into my eyes. It wasn't a reflection. It was like this pure, I was like, self-illumination, like is a thing that I've heard people say. And that, I was like, that makes sense to me now. The self-illumination. It's like this intense colors. And then I was looking around and I was like, oh my God, like even the grass, like flowers are looking more intense to me now. The sun literally looked brighter. Like this isn't a metaphor, nothing like that. Like it literally physiologically was a brighter visual in my eyes, which was wild. I was like, oh my God, this is a real thing. I expected it to take decades to get to this. So I kind of had a mini freak out. Yeah, go for it.
I want to dive deeper into one thing you said. You shifted back into 5, probably. How did you do this shift is something that people want to know.
Well, yeah, I have, yeah. I'm going to be given a perfectly okay session more specifically on this because it's not super involved, but basically you sink in. It's like what I did from 1 to 3 or 3 to 4. I guess 3 to 4 is the exception, but 4 to 5 for sure. Like sinking in until you feel the border was my experience, and then you kind of hop across the border. It's not like it's not a great. I don't have a better way of saying it than that. But basically, like the fundamental thing is letting your system see that next thing as its center of gravity. So I just like had this internal technique that I could do. And that's part of what like training in fluidity is, what Jeffrey and them call it, of like being able to go from 4 to 3 to 2 and blah, blah, blah. Like I knew what the borders between these locations felt like. So when a new one came up, like I knew how to get across that border is kind of what ended up happening. Does that answer your question? I know it's not like super great, but I'm working on language around that.
Yeah. I would say let's move on, and maybe we'll get back to it later if the question arises.
It's like
again.
an active place of me trying to develop ways of communicating to other people. Like, because I think it'd be good for other people to do this for themselves. So work in progress. So I shift into 5. And so because I had developed fluidity, I could actually shift back and forth between 4 and 5 pretty easily. And so I was like, okay, maybe I'm just crazy, but like this feels like it's really a thing. But I would shift into 4. Like I'm literally just walking around. I see a flower that seems really intense to me, like it was an orchid or something, and it was the most purple I've ever seen in my life. And so I was like, okay, maybe I'm just crazy. I shifted into 4, and it looked dull when I shifted into 4. Then I went back into 5. It looked purple again. It was crazy. Like so I could tell that there was a contrast, and it was a different experience.
Could you immediately change between the locations?
Yeah, it was like within seconds I could shift back and forth because I had prioritized getting really fluid from like 2 to 3 to 4, and it's the same fundamental. There's no difference in the technique for the later locations. So yeah, so I was shifting, and part of me was really. This was less than a month of me being in Fundamental Wellbeing from location 1 that I was experiencing this. So I was like, this is impossible. I can't really be experiencing this, even though I know I'm experiencing this. It's like, this can't be location 5. There's no way so few people can make the jump from 4 to 5. And it seemed easier to me than 3 to 4. And I was like, I'm not really experiencing this, kind of freaked out. But that night I was kind of sitting in with 5. I was like, let's see if I can go to the next one. So boom, found the resistance. This time was around my chest, like center of my chest, around my heart. So I shifted there. I was like, all right. Kind of sat with it for a bit. I was like, okay, no sensory glitches, which is what they talk about on the Fundamental Being or the Non-Symbolic website. I was like, shoot, like this is weird that I'm able to keep pushing forward. Like it feels like I should not be able to do this. This seems too easy. It's easier than they've made it sound. I was like, shit, well, like part of me was like, should I keep pushing forward? It seems like an unwise idea because they say that sensory glitches happen to everyone by location 7. And like sometimes it can be as bad as people basically being in a coma and like they don't show up for work for a couple days. I was like, it feels like a really bad idea to do this. But I was like, I had actually been triggered by the fact that I made it further than I thought and then pushed even further. I was like, if this is really location 6 and the next is location 7, this is a bad idea. Don't do it. But like my trauma trigger had taken over at that point, and it was like, it needed to push further to like prove to myself almost that like what I was experiencing was real. Like it was a weird thing. So like my trauma actually pushed me further, if anything, which was crazy.
It was not the idea about Moses coming up that pushed you further?
No, I wouldn't have even thought of that. No, the Moses thing more comes up whenever it's like me trying to interact with other people and like help them, that sort of thing. Like my POK talks, the reason I resisted doing POK talks, even though people tried to get me to do POK talks with them for a while, Eric and Luciano were the first ones to be able to convince me of it because I was like, no, fuck that. I'm not going to do that. Like I was like so resistant to that idea of even giving a whiff of that, like leaning into that pressure. Anyway, so no, it wasn't that. It was just like, there was something about, like, I mean, I was gaslit so much like growing up, and it was like, I just felt like I know what I'm experiencing, but no one's going to believe me is how it felt. But like, so I have to prove it that I'm actually experiencing these things is what the trauma was like. If I had to wrap words around it, like that was what was going on. And so I pushed, and it was, man, I don't know. I was on my bed, just like lying on my bed at the time. And it was excruciating. Like something crazy physiological happened. I don't, like, I know I was like writhing on my bed. I don't know how long it was. Could have been 15 minutes, could have been an hour. I have no idea. It's probably closer to 15 minutes than an hour. Could have been 30 seconds. Like legitimately, like I genuinely have no idea. And when I did, I was like, oh, I may have done something permanent just now. Like this may have been a really bad idea. Like this probably wasn't good, but like no way of stopping it at this point. I guess we got to ride it out. Thankfully, nothing permanent happened. I'm here. We're good. Nothing even temporary really happened. Like it was just that kind of excruciating bit until I stabilized. And once I stabilized, it was fine. And like that flat, everything is just the infinite or the universe or reality. Everyone has a different word for it that they resonate with, but it's like, it's just this. There's no past, no future. It's literally just this as this flat moment. No identity, like all that falls away. And I was like, that is definitely location 7. Like it was such an obvious thing. I think I pushed even to location 8 that night. Like it was all in one night that this was happening. Like within a span of, a couple hours that like I went from 5 to 6 to 7, then to 8. I was like, let's go come back down to earth. And like I came back down to 3 or something like that because that was my home. That was my happy place. And I was like, I just want to feel love and I don't want to do all this crazy stuff. The next night, I was like, let's see what else is out there. So I was exploring some more. Ended up going into 9, and then I pushed past 9 into 10. So within a month of Fundamental Wellbeing, I was in past like location 10 plus was my experience. And I wrote down all the different things I could note about the different experiences. I put it in my own words. I went back because I was intentionally avoiding reading their descriptions of 5 through 9 because I wanted to make sure like I was actually experiencing my own version of it, not just projecting this into my own experience. And sure enough, everything seems to line up almost perfectly from 5 through 9. And then location 10, they didn't have any public descriptions of it. They still really don't. And so I wrote down everything I could about it, and I emailed them because they, at their end of the 5 through 9 description, they're like, almost no one experiences location 10 plus. If you think you are, email us. So I did. I emailed them. Annemiek got back to me and was like, yeah, this sounds like pretty similar to my location 10 plus experiences. We had different ways of framing it, but we could absolutely see that it was the same core experience. Then I saw, but like, no, she couldn't recommend me to connect to anyone else because she's like, no one else that we know of is doing this. And I saw that Luciano was giving a talk on location 7 through 10. This is last year. No, now, we're in 2024. Wow, that was like over a year ago now. That's crazy to think. So he was giving a talk, and I was like, please, Luciano, can we talk? Because like no one else is experiencing location 10 plus, and I have to talk about it with someone. So me and him got on a call. We talked for several hours. I mean, it was probably, the first time we talked was probably like 6 to 8 hours. It was insane. Like we just couldn't stop. And I mean, Luciano, like if you get in a conversation with Luciano, like you're going to talk a lot.
We have 3-part podcasts.
Exactly. Like he has a lot to say, and like you want to listen to everything he says, man. He has like such good things to say about this whole experience. Super crucial. And I like, me and him, sometimes I frame it like, it's like we were holding hands on the journey to fundamental being together after that point that we connected. Cause like we were so in line of like what we were experiencing at each step of the way after that, and having him to talk with about this and really wrestle terminology for what we were experiencing, because it was beyond any public maps. It was beyond anything anyone had really talked about at that point or was talking about regularly. And like, what is this that's going on? And we both had such different experiences of it and ways we approached it. Like he was this just giving up and surrendering person, like, all right, however the process shows up is how it's going to be. And I was like the complete opposite. Even when I had no agency, I could tell there was intentionality every single time I shifted. So it was like, there's definitely an element of control there of like my system, whatever you want to call it. Cause like I couldn't do it, but like my system was absolutely doing it of like, okay, now I am going to go to the next location. And I still had like all these explicit borders that I had this entire way, like between every shift. And so I mean, from there it was like location 10 to, I mean, I can give locations or positions based on what I experienced, but it was like the next 6 positions. Instead of being about the here and now, which is what 4 through 9 is, it's like the present moment, really focused on the present moment and the unfolding, or even just the flat like this. There's no past and future. Location 10 through, 15 that I experienced. So like those 6 was really about, it wasn't even the present moment yet. It was like the moment of unfolding or manifesting before it like finishes manifesting, before it becomes manifested. Yeah, go for it.
Who is experiencing all of that in location 10 to 15? Can you describe a bit like who's the witness or who's noticing
By
that?
location 7, there's really no real experience of a witness. Like that really drops off by location 7. So that's a hard thing to say. Like, but like, you and I have visual sensations coming through our eyes. There is like, we're speaking out of a body, things like that. So a lot of people use the term my system, or like here, this is what's being experienced at that kind of in that phrase. I've always used just I terminology just because it's a useful shorthand. Like if it never meant anything pre-fundamental well-being, if I'm still experiencing the same things, I'm just perceiving it differently, then like what's wrong with, even if it doesn't feel 100% precise to my experience at any given moment, it's useful for communicating. It actually gives people more accurate experience that they can relate to. So, but I mean, the who's experiencing it or perceiving it, stuff like that, that changes depending on where you're at in the progression. Like that, a perceiver comes back. Like it doesn't just disappear completely. It comes back in a way later on. So, and like perceiving and not having a perceiver is the same thing eventually, is what it feels like. And then even the possibility of perception feels like it drops away. So I'm getting ahead of myself, but like to answer your question, there's no one answer to that. It really depends on where you're at. And now it's like, okay. Personally, I get really annoyed when people like insist on using language that gets away from I, even though I understand it. I really do understand it, but like to me, it's so important to communicate with people who aren't experiencing this. Like that's really my whole thing, is like, this is awesome. This changed my life. I haven't been depressed or suicidal since experiencing fundamental well-being, when that was my life for 30 years plus, was experiencing that. Just like, I want to be able to communicate this to as many people as possible, as effectively as possible. So not everyone's like that though. I get that, but it doesn't stop me from being annoyed sometimes when people insist on different language. Blah, blah, blah. Actually, on that note, I will come back a little bit. When I was developing fluidity from like 2 to 4, and even like, by the time I had made it to like 5 through 7 and all that, I had never heard of anyone trying to develop fluidity with non-fundamental well-being, like location 0, sometimes people call it. But I was like, I so wanted to still be able to relate to people, to normal humans. And like the thought of not being able to relate to people and their stories and things like that was really kind of depressing to me. Like obviously not depressing, but it's not what I wanted. Like I wanted to just be a normal person and get on with my life and like have normal relationships. And so I actually effectively shifted successfully a couple times into non-fundamental well-being from location 1. Like I got myself to location 1. Then I got myself embedded in narratives again. Like, oh, you're the best, and like things like that, like just like whatever stupid ego shit I could like sink into. It was kind of crazy because I kind of sank into ego, which is wild. But like stuff like that, or like, no, you're such a fucking idiot, and like whatever story your mind makes up, right? Like I used that to successfully get back into non-fundamental well-being, and man, it was insane how much noise there was just like remaining. And then so I knew I could get back into fundamental well-being because I knew where awakening was. So I used it, and it was physically painful. It felt like there were like needles sticking all throughout my entire body, like nervous system, everything. It felt like needles everywhere. Both times that I successfully like shifted and then shifted back. So I was like, okay, it might not be worth it to do that. So I just kept pushing further instead. Anyway, I say all that because like that's part of why the language thing, like it was so important for me to try to communicate with like non-finders, which is not a term I really love, but people not experiencing this, that I put myself through that. Like that's how important it is for me. Okay, so we're experiencing this like very non-linear, super non-local, like there's no present moment. Like the present moment feels, location 10 plus, it just feels like you can't grasp the present moment. It's super slippery. Like the edges are fuzzy. Some people, this is not everyone. Most people don't even notice that this is happening. But the people who do notice it will sometimes have a thing where like, I would look at a wall and be like, oh yeah, I mean, it happens to show up as a wall for me, but like it could be a flower or the pure concept of love. And it's not like when people hear that before they experience it, they kind of like, whoa, that's crazy. But once you experience it, you're like, oh, like that's silly that's showing that that's happening. Like it starts feeling arbitrary that things are showing up the way they are. Like, it could just be anything. Like, who cares that it's a tree? That could be a dog. Like, I don't know. It just happens to show up as a tree. So you're perceiving like the process of like meaning making almost, or like things becoming actualized in your mind, which is wild. At a certain point, a lot of people start having this feeling of like it's like reality feels like a memory. Like it doesn't feel like you're actually seeing the reality. You're seeing like a memory of reality before you. And then it gives way to, and I know, like, I'd be so shocked if Luciano and Eric didn't talk about these already, to non-existence, what we've called non-existence pretty
So
regularly.
what you just mentioned in Luciano's model would be potentiality?
Yeah, so like potentiality tends to be the word that we've used to talk about it. And like as a real quick background, the reason we talk about these regions of like actuality from 4 to 9, then potentiality is 10 plus, then it goes into non-existence and then totality, is because I had this like 6 position pattern that I could sense in my nervous system. And that just sort of repeated on a deeper, more subtle level. And I could see that each of these 6 positions, so that's why I said 4 through 9, like it was like I had that thing sort of above my forehead, then behind my eyes, then my chest, and then like there was a thing right at my forehead, and then in front of my eyes, and then my limbs. So like that's kind of the 6 position pattern that happened. So location 10 felt like the same spot as location 4, but just like on a subtler, more deeper level. And then that same thing of like, okay, behind my eyes, blah, blah, blah. Like it went through the same thing. So that was potentiality. That's why we have potentiality the thing, is because I had this like pattern. And then non-existence was another one of these where it was like 6 positions in my nervous system that I could like, that's what I tend to use words to describe it as. But like the first thing I experienced when I went from like this potentiality experience of like everything's sort of nonlinear, or like it feels like you're witnessing the pure source, the moment before things manifest. It went to, oh wow, I don't exist anymore. Like I thought I had dropped away the self, but like it feels like I don't exist. I have never existed, and I could not exist. Like it's impossible for me to ever exist. And then, that shifted into like a visual thing, like nothing is looking out of these eyes was kind of a crazy part of that. And then, like my body, like there's no limbic experience. There's no, like, it just felt like I didn't even have a body. This is a little bit more intense than most people have it, but like I washed my hands at a certain point and it felt like the water was running right through my hands. It didn't feel like, which feels when people hear this before they experience it, they think, oh my God, that sounds so crazy, which it is to an extent.
Or dissociative.
Yeah, dissociative, which it is, like, that's not inaccurate to say it's dissociative, but it's also the reason it's not, the reason I don't see it as psychosis is because there's no like negative impact on well-being and things like that, which psychotic experiences that tend to be really intense, temporary, like you go in and out of it. They're not stable. And like, there's a lot of distress tends to be associated with it. I'm not a psychologist or anything, but that's my understanding of it. So it was dissociative, which is actually what one of my concerns was, because I was like, shit, like I was depressed and suicidal all my life. What if I just like, if I don't exist, what's the point of living is kind of how I was worried about it. Because then it then unfolds to like nothing around me exists. Like I'm not even looking at anything. Like, because it was, I knew nothing was looking out of these eyes, but there was still the possibility of things manifesting is what the experience was. But at a certain point, even the possibility of anything manifesting went away. It just literally felt like nothing exists. And I was so worried that I would like get suicidal and like want to kill myself, because like, what's the point? But the good news is that it's so meaningless that even suicide seems meaningless. Like, what's the point of killing yourself? Because it's not going to change anything. Like like everything is absent. Like every action you could possibly take is absent of things. And I've talked with more than one person who had that exact sort of like logic that happened in their brain. They're like, oh wait, but actually, yeah, suicide doesn't even make sense to do because suicide doesn't exist. And like that, like it's kind of a crazy thing. So once I realized that, once that's kind of sank in for me, then I was able to let myself really like, all right, this is what's happening now. Until that point, I had kept fluidity. I could like easily jump back to like location 2, for example, to be more functional.
Would you use that when you go back to work, for example?
Oh yeah, I would stay like 2 through 4 was most of what I subsisted in for a long time. But at a certain point, kind of non-existence just took over, and I wasn't able to get out of it, and it really sucked. That was like 2.5 months through the holidays. I was so worried that I was just going to turn into an asshole and like not want to be around anyone. Like I wasn't going to be around didn't want to be around my family or something, but none of that happened. I was just fine. I don't even, until after I got out of it and I told people about it, no one had any idea that I was experiencing anything different. Like none of my family thought anything of it. Yeah, so it was kind of interesting. So like that really, I think it let my system trust the process a little bit more, which was cool. Like I needed to, like that, things not feeling like there's any meaning behind them, like everything's pointless. Like that's about as bad as it can get on the journey from what I've seen. And man, if you can make it through that and your life doesn't fall apart, it like what's like like you can bring it on. It's kind of how it feels. I knew Luciano at this point because me and him had sort of like I had gotten to non-existence before he did, and me telling him about it, like we talked about it because he had been getting glimpses a little bit. And after our conversation about it, he just like immediately went into non-existence. At least that's what I recall happening. But then I was stuck in non-existence because I was trying to be like functional, right? And non-existence felt so non-functional to me. Like I wanted to feel functional, not just like happen to be functional.
Can you give some examples of how it felt?
Yeah, like if I was going through work and stuff, like I would stop taking initiative, which is there's an element of like I kind of do that again now, but like I can at least take initiative if it makes sense. I can think longer term and things like that. Whereas in non-existence, it's just I can go through the motions, but none of it really makes sense to do. So this like the level of conserving energy is maxed out for the most part. It's crazy. This is where people talk about like just sitting in a chair for a long time, staring at the wall, things like that. I can't remember if it was Eric. Eric may have had that experience of like, yeah, I just sat and stared at my wall for a while because like, what's the point of anything else? It's not uncommon. Yeah, it's not everyone for sure. Like some people have a mild enough experience that they don't even notice it. They like literally don't even think anything of it until we talk to them. They're like, hey, just so you know, like this is a thing that most people go through. They're like, oh, that's what you're talking about. Okay, that makes more sense now. So yeah, I had this like deep non-existence experience, blah, 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 through the holidays. And Luciano and Annemiek both start talking about this new experience where like potentiality and actuality, actual existence and the potential for things start showing back up, even though non-existence is still there, like somewhat in the foreground. They're like saying like, no, like there's something beyond this. And I thought like, I could tell that they were talking about something real that I hadn't seen yet, but I just couldn't, it didn't feel like I could use my same technique to get out of non-existence. Every time I did, it would just be slippery. I couldn't stabilize. Something about like the experience of non-existence felt more true to me. It felt like anything else was kind of made up. Then one day I was sick and I was frustrated because I could still experience frustration. And I realized that I was like, oh shit, like I'm still experiencing unpleasant things, even though it feels like nothing exists. So there was this weird, like I could tell this wasn't fundamental because obviously I was actually experiencing frustration. I was like, oh shit. Well, when I was in location 1 and sick, I didn't feel sick. Like it was awesome. So like, why don't I just go back there? So I did. Like finally being sick kicked me out of non-existence. And it was fine. Like I was able to stabilize in like, 1 through 4 again, like have my fluidity thing. And I was like, okay, now that I've gotten out of it, I'm not trapped there. Maybe I can get to where Luciano and Annemiek are talking about. So sure enough, I like sank all the way through, like did my little technique that I did. At a certain point, I started feeling like playing a scale on a piano where I'd be like 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 10, 10. Okay, I want to sink into 10 now. And that's where I would pick, like I would just boop. Now I drop into that. So I did that all the way through non-existence. I was like, all right, passed it. I knew what it felt like to go into a new region of locations. And man, it was such a relief because like, yes, non-existence was still there, obviously. But I just assumed I would never feel like things actually existed again because it felt like once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. And I remember looking into my bedroom and seeing my lamp. And I was like, that lamp is really there. Like, oh my God, thank God. So it was this like super healing experience for me that like, it wasn't all bleak, meaningless. Because even when I would go like fluidly back to location 2, it was like, yes, I'm experiencing location 2 and agency, whatever, even though agency is different after you've like tasted that stuff, and emotions are different irrevocably. Like you can't ever get that back in the same way. Like underneath it all, it still felt meaningless, meaningless. But now is like, oh, like that was just a stage. The meaninglessness was just a stage. It wasn't fundamental. Thank God. Like that's just happens to be another concept, like along with the manifesting, the potentiality, the possibility, along with it actually manifested the actuality, the existence. All that was just a concept. And I was like, man, what's past this? Like I was like, let me do the thing and push past it. And that's when like I spent a little bit of time where like the body starts showing up side by side with non-existence and potentiality and stuff. I had an experience in the shower of like, I knew I was washing my hair, but it felt like I was like my head was over here, like I couldn't place my body in space time. And yeah, it was kind of interesting. And I was like, okay, what's next? Like I know Luciano loves this spot and he talks about it a lot. Annemiek. It's like it feels like there might be something next. Like it felt like I could just arbitrarily keep pushing into further and further regions of positions and locations. And so the next thing was this like beautiful, subtle bliss. It was awesome. It was so beyond words. And when I first shifted there, because anytime I shifted to a new location or region or whatever, I tried to wrap words around, okay, what's different now than what came before? Yeah.
Where are we now on your model?
The pure qualities, yeah. This would be quality 1 that I'm
okay.
talking about now. Yeah. We've called it like serenity in the model, like in the talks that we've given. Like I don't know where Luciano, I haven't seen Luciano's model in a while. So I don't know how he frames it still, but
so this is what after totality comes.
Yeah, totality is like that multi-layered, like I just didn't spend much time in there because I knew like Luciano and Annemiek did a pretty bang up job of like nailing it down and describing it. Like as soon as I shifted there, I was like, this is exactly what they talk about. Like I did not have to do any kind of exploration. So I intentionally, that was the first time I intentionally skipped over locations because I could sort of do that with my little mental technique.
So then quality 1 might be in Luciano's model primordial force.
Yeah, it's like serenity or the primordial force, depending on like the language you want to use. But so for me, the interesting thing here is, and I didn't notice it until after I got into the second, like what I call quality 2. But locations kind of stopped making sense here. So like I tried arbitrarily just like pushing, and my expectation of I call it like a consciousness parlor trick of being able to like, oh, just arbitrarily keep going further and further on the continuum. I expected either to run into a brick wall one day and there's no more locations, or to just infinitely there's going to be changes and like new things I could do. And it's just kind of, you pick what spot you want to stop, if you ever stop. And the thought of pushing indefinitely exhausted me. But I kind of got a combination of both of those, or like really neither of those. Because once I got to this like first quality, the quality 1, serenity, the primordial force, it like I was like, let's just see how much further I can go. And I pushed further arbitrarily, and nothing changed. It was the first time that I could push further, and genuinely nothing changed. So I was like, oh, this is interesting. Like, this is something new now. Like, this is completely different. Like, after totality, what Luciano calls totality, Annemiek used the word allness for that previous experience. Like, this feels like a new thing. Like, something qualitatively new is happening here. It doesn't line up with what came before it. It doesn't fit into what I can tell from the Martin Matrix. Like, this is a very new thing. It almost felt like, let me first say, when I first got to this experience, I mean, dude, it was so subtle and pure and delicate and blissful. Words don't do it justice. Any word you could say for it is too heavy. Like it feels wrong as soon as you say it. But I thought, this feels like a gentle breeze blowing across an otherwise still lake. Like that's as close as I could get to accurately describing my experience. This like gentle, I mean, this is why Luciano calls it the force. It's just like, it feels like it's sort of animating everything, or allowing even animation itself to be possible. It feels like it allows possibility to be possible. Like not things, but possibility itself is possible because of this thing that you're experiencing in and behind everything. And man, I felt like I had arrived. Like it felt like the most pure layer 3 experience of like just that full, like rich, delicate fullness and love but like love is the wrong word. Love feels vulgar to say. Like that's how pure this is. That the word love. At one point we came up, me and Luciano, because I was like, hey, by the way, this is the next thing I experienced. He's like, shoot, I thought I was regressing when I got glimpses of that. So he used that as a technique to like go further. Like just coming back to like me and him keep like we've constantly pushed each other like back and forth further and deeper, which has been awesome to have. And so he was like, oh my God, like, yes, I see what you mean. And we had so many conversations that lasted for hours where we're trying to wrap words around it. Because that was our whole thing, was wrapping words around our experiences. And every single thing we would say, we'd be like, oh, I got it. And then we'd say it and we're like, nope, that's wrong. And like, no, wait, maybe it's this. Nope, that's wrong. And then at one point we were even like, it's so delicate and pure. It's almost like God's breath. And as soon as, I can't remember which one of us said it, but I was like, that feels vulgar. It feels profane. That's how pure and delicate this experience was, right? It's crazy. Yeah, not everyone experiences the bliss part of it like as intensely as I did, but most people have that sense of like something is like giving rise or animating things, and it's this like really delicate sense of movement or something. So yeah, that's quality one, and then so I was able to like Luciano ended up having a thing he was describing that sounded like it was beyond this first quality. And I was really frustrated because it felt like I had arrived. I was like, this is everything I ever wanted out of fundamental well-being. This feels, to me, that thing, this serenity is what I was calling it, which is inaccurate, but I specifically use the word because it's inaccurate, because you can't be accurate. It felt like what, I kept saying something like, location 3 wishes it was this. Like that's what it was. It was so awesome. So like every location 3 finder, just keep pushing past non-existence. Like trust me, it gets like better than you can imagine. So he said like, oh, here's this thing that's starting to show up, or this is how it's starting to show up. And I was like, at this point I knew every time Luciano pushed further than I did, and like I knew it was a new experience. Like I could tell at this point, because we had done that song and dance so many times. And he was describing this thing. I was like, man, now you're going to make me push past this beautiful thing that I'm experiencing. And sure enough, I found it was a different technique I had to use. It was like, because locations stopped making sense. Like they didn't, like I couldn't like fixate in a position in my nervous system. Like there was no border anymore between these different positions. Like they were all just sort of like, I don't know, it was really interesting. But I found a technique that I could get to the experience he was talking about. And it felt like a layer was being peeled off my entire body. Like I had to like shift. It was almost like I fell backwards into this next thing. So like, all right, lift off this layer and lift off this layer. So that was quality 2. I spent a little bit of time in it, not much. Because at this point I was like, I just want to arbitrarily keep going until I find a stopping point, because I'm tired of having a progression. Like I just want to get it over with is how I felt. So quality 2, quality 3, what he's termed in the past omni integration, which I think he includes more into omni integration now. Because it is this like sense of like, I mean, what I call quality 2, or like we called it pure layer 4 for a while. That was the first time where it felt like I can't tell if I'm alive or dead. Like that question doesn't make sense to me anymore. Like both, neither, either. I don't know. Like also, who cares? It's kind of how it felt. Like I could be dead. Like who knows? Like that question stopped making sense, which is a thing that Luciano had said. I was like, oh, I get what you're saying now. So I kept going, quality 2, quality 3, and then the next thing that happened, man, it was as soon as I got there, it's like everything felt available again. Every experience on the continuum, layers, locations, all these qualities, all that just felt like it was there. And the closest thing I could think was like, this feels like what totality felt like, with those like non-existence and potentiality and actuality in the body. Like they're all showing up at the same time simultaneously. But except in this time, there's no borders between any of them. Like they're just all instantly there, and they're the same thing. There's nothing in between them. And I thought, man, Luciano is going to love this. It's like what I thought, because he was so into totality and like he felt like he arrived. He was really frustrated whenever he was getting glimpses of bliss after totality, because he loved being like, it's like he could see everything from like this distance, and he was like fully transcendent. And yeah, so like he ended up like shifting there pretty soon after that. I think he was getting glimpses of it, if nothing else, by that point. And like we both like shifted around the same time. We were able to talk about it, and over time it started being really obvious, one, that opposites were both true for a lot of things. So like you could say things like, I am in peace even when I'm stressed out of my mind, and I'm completely at peace. They're both 100% true. I am in deep peace even when I'm in deep conflict. I never judge myself even when I'm explicitly judging myself. Like these things that literally they can't both be true, but they subjectively are true. I was telling my sister this, stuff like this, and she's like, because nothing could take away the feeling of fundamental being anymore. That experience you have in locations 1 through 3 of like, ah, shit, like I'm getting, my mind is taking me out of awakening. It's impossible. It's absolutely impossible now. Like there's nothing, intense trauma can sort of take you out of it sometimes. Like that's the one thing I've seen be able to really, because it's so overwhelming to the system. Like I had 15 minutes in this past year where like this was overshadowed. I've talked to a few other people who had like more intense traumas that they've been working through, and like it has like, it's been longer for them. Sometimes it's really intense, but almost even with the most intense traumas, usually this sense of peace that everything's okay is in the foreground all the time. It never recedes to the background. I had kidney stones towards the end of last year, and I was puking. I was writhing on the ground on the bathroom. And I still had this thought went through my head. Is it ethical to call into work today? Because like, that's how fine I felt, like subjectively. And like, obviously I called into work because I could tell it was so bad and it was getting worse, right? But like, that's like, I was at a 10 out of 10 pain. I felt like I was going to pass out in the doctor's office. And thankfully I had a friend be able to like take me to the ER so they could deal with it. But like at the same time, I'm writhing in pain, knowing I'm about to pass out. And it was still like, yeah, but I'm fine. Like I'm fine with this. It's crazy. So that sort of thing is such a huge part of the, like that lately I've been using the phrase return to humanity, where like, it just feels like you're an ordinary human again. Unpleasant things come back. Like tons of deconditioning tends to come back for people around this time, especially if you haven't had a long process of like decades or years. Like your system has to kind of catch up with your awakening, and like it has to clear out at some point. Because when you're in non-existence, none of it exists. So like it's hard to decondition because like none of it's really happening is what it feels like. But man, when you're back into, when the human, ordinary, just normal person comes back into awakening, I mean, there's nothing to resist all that deconditioning anymore. It's just like, oh, it's amazing. Yeah. And then there's at least one more shift that happens after that. But we're so beyond words for it right now. I don't think we have good language to even talk about it, but it's kind of intense at times.
After these regions or locations, and basically you have this reintegration, becoming a human again.
Yeah, exactly. Like to me, I mean, and I've heard more than one person say this independently, which is kind of great. They're using their own words, but I can tell what they're saying is like, you don't have to choose between humanity and freedom. Like you don't have to choose between transcendence and being a normal freaking human. Like, which is everything I'd wanted, right? Like that is what I was so desperate to still be able to communicate with non-finders. And honestly, for a while after getting to this part of the journey, it was easier for me to relate to people who weren't in fundamental well-being than it was for me to relate to people who were in fundamental well-being. Because I could engage with stories again. Stories were not a big deal anymore. Like they didn't take me out of fundamental well-being. I didn't care. I was interested in them. I could engage with them. I could communicate in stories again. It didn't feel fake. It didn't feel anything like that. It's just, I mean, it's a normal part of existence. It just became part of everything else. So like that was, man, I can't tell you how amazing everything since then has been. It felt like a process had come to an end when it came to like the transcendence and reintegration and everything. But it felt like everything else in my life took off. Like everything else just started dynamically unfolding and progressing in ways that I couldn't control and wouldn't want to control, even if like I could, you know. It's just like my life objectively had gotten so much better since this. It's crazy. It's absolutely insane. I love it so much. So yeah, I'm pretty hardcore about just telling people to keep pushing the gas and like get here as fast as you can. Anyway, so yeah.
Where are you now? How is your experience right now?
Yeah, this is part of the tricky thing. Me and Luciano both. He definitely started shifting here first, and I was, as usual, a little frustrated that he was experiencing something new, because I was like, I was telling people, even though I knew it was a bad idea, I was sort of calling this the end of the process. with the human coming back, mostly because the 10 Oxforders paintings and the Zen Circle both seem to end at this, like, the human comes back. I mean, for like, if you look at the 10 Oxford paintings, the last one is the return to the marketplace, which, like, if you think of like economics and all the bullshit that you have to deal with in like like a capitalist society, I know that's not those paintings probably, they weren't from the perspective of a capitalist society, but still the marketplace, haggling and things like that. Like, it's not fun for finders usually. For people who are awakened and like transcendent, you're not really wanting to deal with that bullshit. But like, all that's fine now, right? Like, it doesn't bother me. Like, sure, I'll have like some conditioning come up around it, but then I notice how absurd the conditioning is, and it just, like, it can't stick anymore. It's impossible. So that was like so awesome to me, and I was saying, like, into the process. But then Luciano was like, "Oh, by the way, this thing is happening," and also me and him were talking about it. And it was another thing where I could tell it was something new. Like, I could tell he was not just having some sort of niche, like, thing that's in the same experience. Like, it was a genuinely new experience that he was having. So I was like, all right, well, if it happens, it happens. I'm not, like, it doesn't bother me. Like, I don't feel the need to go there. Then one day we were talking about it, and boom, all of a sudden he said something. I can't remember what he said, or like something like, it felt like the universe was dying and being reborn in every moment. And I was like, okay, I can't get into that, but I knew based on the differences of how we experience and interpret things, maybe if I say, like, it feels like myself is dying and being reborn, because like he tends to have this like universal interpretation of things and like perspective, which Annemiek was really similar, and that was like part of what made it hard to sync up our language, but also really good that we had to sync up our language. Because like mine was always just so grounded in like this individual perspective, even if I didn't identify with an individual, right? Like, I could still feel it housed in this body. And so I was like, okay, he said the universe is dying and being reborn. What if I just like entertained the thought of myself dying and being reborn, and then all of a sudden everything dropped away? It was so crazy. It's been deepening. I don't think any new shifts have been happening since then. I think it probably stabled out, but it's hard to tell. But the main difference that I've noticed is like, so before I could say like agency and no agency, that doesn't make sense to me. Like, the difference doesn't make sense anymore. They are the same thing. Not they're intermingled, not they overlap, not that I understand them both, but like they literally are the same thing. There's like, I don't even know where I would start trying to judge whether or not I have agency. So like, how could I not have agency? But also they both make sense to me, blah, blah. Now I can't even perceive decisions or intentions. Like, I can't, like,
Can you explain who had the intention to join my podcast?
well, yeah, but like, what could be not an intention is like how it feels subjectively. Like, I can't, for something to not be a decision, like everything's a decision all the time, or nothing is a decision ever, is like subjectively, like, it's not like, because I could like conceptually, I was like, okay, fine, like, decisions, free will doesn't make sense. Like, I don't give a shit. Like, I'm still gonna make decisions. But before, like I was talking about, there was all this control of like each shift. I could see the intention happening even when it didn't feel like I was making the decision. I could see my system going, oh, here's the resistance, we're gonna hop over it. And then for a little bit, those both seemed like the same thing. Like, yeah, it's me, yeah, it's not me. But now it literally, like, I don't even know how I would determine the difference between being free or being human. Like, what is not human? What is human? Like, I can't perceive that anymore. An interesting side effect of this, and I'm not the only person who's said this, and I haven't talked to a lot of people in here, so this is why I'm like really cautious about saying a lot about it and very much couching it in my own experiences. But like, someone asked me a question about when my Zoom profile picture was taken, and I knew I used to be able to answer that in terms of like, okay, yeah, I'll just think about the present moment, and I kind of count backwards from the present moment, how many years ago that was. And I couldn't do that anymore. Like, I couldn't find the present moment to count backwards from. So I was like, wait, how do I answer this now? It was crazy. Like, I had to instead find an anchor point around the same time that picture was taken. And like, I go, okay, I know that was 2020. And like, I had to like triangulate the past. I couldn't remember from myself what the past and I can't imagine the future from myself. Like, there's no entry point there, which has been interesting. Anyway, so yeah, that's about all I can say with that. Like, we could probably talk a little bit more, but I don't know that I'll have much.
Let me try to get something more out of you about the present moment right now. So I think it'd be interesting maybe if you can share something. You sit right now in front of a computer, but how's your experience right now? Like, who's giving this interview?
In front of a computer? But like, it's not like the only response I have to that is the question feels wrong. It feels like the wrong question to ask. Like, I don't really have an answer there, because like, sure, there are images here and there's a thing speaking here, and I know all this seems like a crazy experience, but like I can use a shorthand saying I'm experiencing all this, but what isn't? If the universe is doing this through me, then the universe is doing everything, is like kind of how I'm trying to rationalize it. So what couldn't be in this interview? Like, everything in the universe has to happen for this interview to happen. I guess is sort of how it subjectively feels. If I had to wrap words around it, which you're forcing me to right now, so yeah, day-to-day basis, I don't really think about it. I just like go about, like, there's no decisions anymore, so just there's no person doing anything anymore.
Let's continue with the next question. So a lot of people who listen to the podcast are not yet in fundamental well-being or not yet awakened, basically in location 0. Do you have any general advice for them? What should they try out to finally awaken?
Yeah. I feel like I'm gonna probably just parrot a lot of what Jeffrey has said over the years, but people told me I'm really good at distilling things that Jeffrey has taught, so I'm gonna do that today. So the main thing for me is like, you are not working in the mind, we're working on the mind. Okay? So learning more about awakening or fundamental well-being is not gonna necessarily help you get to awakening or fundamental well-being. And in fact, it can be a hindrance.
Except listening to the Max Hack podcast.
Yeah, well, this is just osmosis at this point. Honestly, though, like, I genuinely see, like, if people are hearing other people's stories and getting a wide, like, I know you're doing that as a joke, but I do think that, like, hearing different perspectives of what awakening can feel like is absolutely going to be a genuinely helpful thing.
These are pointings, basically.
Exactly. Like, oh, it can be like that. It doesn't, like, that resonates with me. It took like several hours of conversations for Luciano to say the thing that finally got me into this new phase, right? So like, I think it's awesome what this podcast is. So yes, everyone keep watching Max Hug Podcast. Subscribe, like and subscribe, ring that notification bell. Go on all your favorite podcast services, Spotify, Apple, whatever. I don't know all the other ones.
When they have done that for awakening, what do you suggest then?
Right. So once you've done that, that's 100% the first step, absolutely necessary, right? But after that, really, let me back up a little bit, because for me, I'm so grateful that I did EMDR before awakening, because it gave me such a foundation of this idea of you work on the mind, not in the mind. Because most people, when they think of therapy and trauma, they think, I'm going to sit down and we're going to dive into my memories and we're going to talk about it. The issue with trauma is that trauma happens when your mind literally cannot integrate the experience it's having. So to try to use the mind to get into that, you have nothing to work with, and it's going to make it worse, if anything. Like, genuinely, that's almost 100% the experience is that it makes it worse. So you have to just use body-based experiences and things that kind of trick your mind into just like being able to feel safe and be able to go into these things and like integrate them more and more. So I had that as a basis. One of my first sessions with my therapist, the thing he said made the most difference for not only my EMDR therapy, but for my awakening. He said, EMDR works on pre-verbal infants. So I knew at that point that I didn't have to figure it out. I could trust the process. Like, if a pre-verbal infant can resolve trauma through this method, I don't have to do it anymore. Like, I can just like go along for the ride. That's kind of how you have to treat awakening methods. So if you want to like look up Finding Your Meditation Fit by Jeffrey Martin, his talk on that, that's how you want to treat these sorts of methods, Headless Way, different things like that. I'm not great with all these different methods because I only used Finding Your Meditation Fit to do it. but it's not about what makes the most sense to you. It's about what is making the most change in you. Like you don't want, whenever you're doing and meditating, it doesn't even need to feel like you're awakening in the meditation. It doesn't need to feel good. You don't want to be uncomfortable. Like be comfortable. You don't have to be in pain when you're meditating, but you really are just doing the process and trying to notice what's your life like outside. How are you actually changing? As long as that change seems to be happening, keep going. Like you can trust the process at that point. At some point, you are very likely to get a glimpse where you'll be like, this is what they're talking about with awakening. It's like this piece that doesn't make sense, where it feels like everything's okay, even though maybe things in your life aren't great. And then you can use that and just focus on that with this gentle, open appreciation. And then, yeah, like that's kind of the formula is like try to use methods that change you, that affect you, get a glimpse of this like amazing peace, awakening, whatever you want to call it. And then just focus on that gently and let it expand throughout your system if you can. The more you do that, the more you can tap into that glimpse and like invite them into your system, basically, like welcome them to be the foundation of your experience. Eventually you stabilize. Like that tends to be the process. Yeah, that's my typical advice. And then once you're stabilized, it's basically the same thing. Like everyone who's made progress, sinking in to that sense of fundamental well-being is the thing that people do. Even though it looks different, it's not like they're sitting in a chair necessarily. Like Luciano went on walks all the time. Like almost all of his shifts happened when he was on a walk. I was laying in bed for a lot of these. But I was sitting in this chair whenever I had that conversation with Luciano, and he like shifted me on accident. So like things like that, like it can take any form, but it still is like that sense of fundamental well-being and that peace that you're trying to tap into and just make it your stable everyday experience. It's awesome. I highly recommend trying for it, guys. It's unbelievable. The thing, like, now that I've made it past, like once you make it past like non-existent totality, all that stuff, and the integration really happens, especially once the human comes back, I personally feel like it's impossible to overhype how good it is. Like genuinely, it feels like there are no like downsides anymore to it. Like you don't have to make any trade-offs between, oh, do I want to be functional or in fundamental well-being? Like, no, it's always there all the time. So like it's worth awakening and then pushing deeper. Like 100%. That is absolutely worth doing. So, yeah.
What's your vision for fundamental well-being? What's your vision for your own involvement in all of that?
Yeah, man. Well, you introduced me. You said, I'm researching and I'm an entrepreneur and an author. The research has been really interesting. It just naturally kind of rose out of me and Luciano's conversations with each other. And we kept being like, it'd be really awesome to map out these things that aren't being publicly written about with Jeffrey and his team, because they're just focused on more of the earlier stuff, which is great, because we really don't have to focus on that anymore, because they've done amazing work over the past 15 years when it comes to initially transitioning and like documenting the like 1 through 4 especially, but even 5 through 9 now. So at one point we decided like, let's really do a research project and like focus on, try to get a handle on people's progressions and what it looks like. And just see if we can communicate this to other people. And we wanted to do it like do legit, like through like get ethics board approval and things like that, which we're doing. Now we're being hosted by Penn State University. We ended up teaming up there. So it's like officially academic research project, even though I'm an independent researcher. I have a bachelor's in general studies from UL Lafayette. So it's nothing crazy from a research perspective, but like there's research projects legit. Luciano's a PhD professor, Pierce Silguero, who is hosting. He's the primary investigator on this. He's a professor at Penn State University. So it's going to be awesome. Just want to do it peer reviewed, all this sort of thing to really get kind of the next chapter of the awakening journey well documented and things like that. So it's really exciting. But for me, so like that's kind of a small part of what I'm focused on right now. I feel like, because to me, I've been feeling, especially over the past few weeks, this moral imperative to get as many people experiencing fundamental well-being as possible. And Vesper agrees, like she's with it. But really, I feel like fundamental well-being should be mainstream. Like, I don't want it to be this niche thing that you have to be a spiritual person or like wanting to get into mystical stuff or super religious or new age or anything like that to do it. It really should just be as normal as nutrition or exercise. It's normally how I think of it. And specifically with nutrition, I mean, if you compare it to religion, like religion used to be where you got your nutrition advice for a lot of places. You know, like you have like, oh, you can eat this and not that, blah blah blah. Like you're following this religion, so this is what you eat. But now we also have like the scientific viewpoint of nutrition. That's like you don't. It doesn't have to take over the religious viewpoint. It's just another viewpoint that can actually help it be better for your life and things like that. That's kind of how I see Jeffrey's work on fundamental well-being. Is like it doesn't need to replace any religious stuff. Like it used to be that we only had religion to be able to access this experience of awakening and fundamental well-being, but now we have another perspective, and it can actually make your religious experience better just by having this new perspective. So that's kind of how I see it. As like, I mean, people should be able to treat it as eating right or going to the gym. Like, oh, I'm gonna deepen in my experience of fundamental well-being. You know, we'll have better language, I'm sure, less verbose language, but something to that effect is how I see it. Like, I just want it. I don't know. Really, I feel like it's gonna be a good idea for it to be mainstream and people see it as an option and just be available for everyone because it's awesome. It's the best thing that's ever happened to me by far. And I've had a lot of really good things. I've had a lot of bad things happen to me, like granted, but I've had so many good things happen to me, and nothing comes close to this, not even remotely. It's amazing, and yeah. So a lot of my efforts are around like we're organizing a conference that's gonna be happening later this year. We have Angelo DeLula as a keynote speaker now, which is exciting. And yeah, we're organizing a conference specifically focused on awakening and like targeted to people who are already awakened, but absolutely open to people who are not awakened because the osmosis effect is going to be strong there and it's going to be really exciting. Probably I'm starting on building a network of like coaches to help people stabilize and deepen in fundamental well-being, hopefully working with the Fundamental Wellbeing Foundation a little bit to like not only like push more people towards the 45 days to awakening course, but maybe we can help people like stabilize after they've been through the course and things like that. Yeah, I'm also just as of yesterday agreed to start working on a short novel with someone because I've had it in my head that it'd be awesome to have a fictionalized version of like the map I shared with you, basically of like the process of awakening and how it can you can be experienced it and stuff like that, but like just as a story form, which I think would be really awesome. It could help just introduce the idea to people a little bit more, just to make a short, punchy, like really well-written book. So yeah, got a lot going on right now. But I'm excited, man. Like this is gonna be a really interesting year for fundamental well-being. Like I think we're if we're not already past a tipping point, we're definitely like really, really close, it feels like. So I'm very excited.
Thanks for watching all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this episode, you will probably like this video here. So click on that now to watch this next. And I'm sending you much love.